Hey everyone, welcome back to Engelbard Gaming. I haven't done a video on SBCs, also known as single board computers, in a while, so you might think I'm done covering them. If you think that,
well, you're wrong!
Yes, today I'll be looking at the Raspberry Pi 5 running the recently released gaming OS for it, Lakka. Well, recent-ish anyway, it came out about 6 or so weeks ago as I record this. And I'll tell you right off the bat that this video is very different from the one that I intended to make, but we'll get into that shortly. I'll go through a super brief history of the Pi as a retro gaming platform, its value, its performance, and the overall experience. Alright, a super brief history of the Pi as a retro gaming device. The original Raspberry Pi was released in 2012. It had a 700 MHz single-core CPU and initially 256 megabytes of RAM, but later models bumped that up to 512 megabytes. It honestly didn't perform great with many emulators back then, but it was small, it was cheap at only $25 or $35 depending on the model, and it was this neat new thing to mess around with. Over the years, new models came along, specifically the 2B, 3B, and 3B Plus, which all kept the $35 price point. With each new model, there were improvements made to performance and the tech inside the Pi, making it much more viable as a general computing and emulation platform. We saw retro gaming focused operating systems like RetroPie, Batocera, and Lakka come along, and many builds depended on them. The Pi 4 eventually came out with multiple RAM configurations in 2019, and this time prices ranged from $35 for 1GB up to $75 for 8GB. Eventually, the 2GB model dropped to $35, and this was still a decent deal for the performance it offered. Now the Pi 5 just showed up in October of 2023, and it only came in 4 and 8GB models, which sold for $60 and $80 respectively. A $5 per unit price bump from the equivalent Pi 4 configurations. So not a dramatic increase despite the internet's reaction. Now, there are two problems here. The first is the hidden price of the Pi. With a Raspberry Pi, you only get the board when you buy it. No storage, no HDMI cable, no AC adapter, no heatsink, no fan, and no case. Factor that stuff in, and you're easily over $100 now. Probably closer to $140 or so when all is said and done for the 4GB model. Now there are many kits out there that go for around $150 that include all of that stuff. The issue here is that modern mini PCs priced as low as $80 come with all those things I just mentioned, work out of the box, and outperform the Pi, typically by a lot. And if you want anything fancier for your Raspberry Pi 5, like say NVMe storage, well you might be over $200 at that point. And a typical $200 mini PC these days will absolutely crush the performance of a Pi 5. Seriously, it's not even close. So just keep that in mind as we head into the performance section of this video. Now I've done videos comparing the various versions of the Raspberry Pi in the past and the Retrogaming Experience on them, using operating systems like RetroPie and Lakka. Particularly, I did stuff on the 3, 3B, and 4B. I also compared them to some other popular and not so popular SBCs to see how they stacked up. The Pi 5's been out for a while now, and while I've had one for a while, I haven't done any videos on it. How come? Well, some of the biggest gaming-based operating systems haven't been available. Sure, there's been stuff like Batocera, and you could install Android and other emulators on it individually, but there's no official RetroPie yet, and as I said at the start of this video, Lakka only came out a few weeks ago. So what's this Lakka thing? It's basically a Linux-based operating system that automatically boots into RetroArch. If you're familiar with RetroArch, Lakka is pretty awesome. Personally, I like keeping the OS on systems like the Pi 5 really light and simple. I'm fine with a quick text-based menu. I'd rather have that and not bother with fancy-looking interface with pictures and stuff if I don't have to. You can still do a lot of that stuff in Lakka if you want to, but I don't, so you won't see it here. Now, I tested the Pi 5 with Batocera a few months ago and decided not to do a video on it at that time because it just wasn't ready for prime time. Some systems weren't supported, and performance on some systems was surprisingly poor, and frankly, I expected more out of it. And I want to stress, I do not and never will blame the developers. I think there's something going on with the Pi 5 hardware, either with documentation or drivers. There's got to be some kind of issue somewhere. Now currently, we're sitting at 9 months past the release of the Pi 5, and it's pretty surprising that there still hasn't been an official version of RetroPie for it, and there have to be pretty big reasons for that. But as I said, we do have Lakka now, so I figured it was time to give the Pi 5 a whirl again. Now there's another reason I like Lakka over Batocera and some other retro gaming based operating systems. It has a super super duper easy external drive support feature. You don't need to change any folder names, you don't have to create new folders, you don't have to let the system create new folders. You can set the folders up however you want, wherever you want on the drive. This level of external drive support meant I could just take the drive that I already use for my computers and other devices and just plug it straight into the Pi without having to change anything on it at all. So thanks for that one, Lakka devs, it's greatly appreciated. If you want to try it out for yourself, Lakka lives on the website lakka.tv. It's got a straightforward download process, and you can use any image writing tool you want to load it onto a microSD card. I used Balena Etcher. Since this isn't a tutorial, I'm not going to go into any of the install process in detail. Alright, here's just a little montage of the 16-bit and below games and systems you can expect to work well on the Pi 5. All the usual suspects are here. I won't waste your time naming them like I did in my Pi 4 video, which was a whopping 4 years ago, back when I really sucked at all this. At least sucked worse than I do now. Where does the time go? But yeah, if 16-bit games and below tickle your fancy, well, good news for your fancy, my friend. It will be thoroughly tickled. Now, where I'll explain things just slightly is that this will include all 8 and 16-bit home systems and lots of arcade games, but I'm also going to throw the original 32-bit PlayStation in this section, since things on it run fine on the Pi 5, just as I did on the Pi 4. And same for the 32-bit Game Boy Advance. Where the Pi 4 had run into trouble back then, and even with an overclock, was getting satisfactory performance out of stuff like the Jaguar, Saturn, sometimes N64, Dreamcast, and PSP. So enjoy this little montage for a few more seconds, and then we'll talk about those systems and beyond individually very briefly. Alright, so first up, here's some Jaguar games. If you saw my Pi 4 video from 4 years ago, most of them ran way too slow, but a few were okay. Things are vastly better on the Pi 5. Most of the games I tried run at full speed or right on the very cusp of it. And this is all through Virtual Jaguar in RetroArch. You won't get as good an experience as you will with, say, Big PMU on a Windows-based PC, but a fair amount of games work pretty well on it, and the improvements in performance over the Pi 4 are very noticeable. It might not work well with your favorite Jaguar game though, so before getting a Pi 5 for something like this, I'd suggest checking a compatibility list for Virtual Jaguar to make sure it'll work. The most pleasant surprise on the Pi 5 was the performance of Saturn emulation. On the Pi 4, it wasn't great. That's not a strong enough way to describe it. It was shit. Yeah, that's better. Now, I'm not knocking the emulator authors or anything. It was just the reality of the hardware in the Pi 4. On the Pi 5, you can actually run Saturn games with the Beetle Saturn core, and every game I tried ran at full speed, which was kinda shocking. There was even enough overhead left for me to fast forward and have it actually work. When it comes to Saturn emulation, Lakka on the Pi 5 gets the job done. Mostly. What do I mean with that singular cryptic word? We'll talk about that in just a couple of minutes towards the end. Anyway, Saturn emulation is good on the Pi 5 and probably the single best thing about it. I won't spend a lot of time on N64, here's just a little bit of it. I'll note that games that work fine on the older Pis, well, I had trouble getting a lot of them to even launch in Lakka on the Pi 5. When they worked, performance was fine, but I had lots of crashes while loading titles that loaded without a hitch on older Pis. C'est la vie. I wanted to test more N64 on here, but it just wasn't possible. Now, Lakka handles Dreamcast emulation pretty well in the Pi 5 overall. Basically everything I tested ran completely fine. Well, at least at 1x resolution. I tried a bunch of games at 2x resolution, and most of the time that resulted in significant frame rate dips. But the performance here at 1x at least was fine. I didn't encounter any serious issues. I will note that with an overclock to 3 GHz, performance was definitely a bit better than the stock 2.4 GHz CPU speed. Still, either way, you'll get a noticeable improvement on Dreamcast emulation over the Pi 4. Now back on the Pi 4, PSP emulation was still really spotty, which I pointed out in that now ancient video I did on the Pi 4. Difficult to run games like the Wipeout titles, Tomb Raider, and the God of War games performed pretty poorly even at 1x resolution. Things did improve a bit over time, I have to admit, which I showed in some subsequent videos. Now on the Pi 5, everything I tried on PSP was full speed at 1x, and most things are okay even at 2x. Some games are great at 3x on PPSSPP right now. Just be prepared for those few outliers that currently have to be run at 1x resolution for full speed. Now I showed you one of the Wipeout games and the performance difference at 1x, 2x, and 3x resolutions in my 2019 Pi 4 video, so I figured, hey, let's do that here again for the sake of symmetry. Here's Wipeout Pulse. It's totally full speed at 1x resolution, but looks a little bit chunky as you might expect. At 2x resolution, it looks noticeably better, and still manages to maintain full speed without any noticeable dips. At 3x, well, that's where we sort of hit the limit. That was asking a little too much, and now we have lots of dips below 60 frames per second. So I would say to consider any games that run at 3x resolution a bonus. Plan for 2x on several titles at least for reliable full speed. With the power of the Pi 5, we should be able to run GameCube games fine now, right? Now, there have been lots of videos of people running GameCube games on the Pi 5 for months at this point. And here's the thing. With Dolphin via Lakka, you can run a few games on GameCube just fine at roughly full speed. Fire Emblem Path of Radiance here is one that ran just about perfectly through my testing. But just try and run F-Zero GX. It's pretty much a slideshow even at 1x resolution, no matter what settings you change. And before you ask, yes, I confirmed it's running on multiple CPU cores. You may have seen video of Metroid Prime running pretty well, and it does for a while. Until it doesn't. I don't think anyone was trying to mislead, I think maybe they didn't play enough of it. Other games struggled with performance too. Overall, the experience wasn't good in the several games that I tried. And when it comes to Wii games, well, in general, they were even worse. Even simple games that I could run at full speed on the lowest of low-end mini PCs, like Chocobo's Mysterious Dungeon, couldn't handle full speed at 1x resolution on the Pi 5. Now, you could still find some Wii games that work okay. The very simple-looking Phantom Brave here maintained 60 frames per second without dropping at all during my testing. But I quickly learned that Wii emulation on the Pi 5 via Lakka was essentially a bust. So not pictured in this video, 3DS, Switch, PS2. The very work-in-progress PlayStation 2 emulator Play is included, but frankly, I couldn't get anything I tried to work with it, so that's why you don't see it in this video. 3DS just isn't supported in this version of Lakka, nor is Nintendo Switch. As for other systems, you won't find support on here for Xbox, Xbox 360, PlayStation 3, Wii U, PS Vita, or anything beyond. Okay, deep breaths, deep breaths. The experience of working with the Raspberry Pi 5 for this video was terrible. I can't stress that enough. I had more issues with it than any other SBC I've ever worked with, and I've worked with a lot of them. I don't know if it's because of the hardware differences between the Pi 5 and the prior Pis, but things were just a complete and total nightmare. Normally, I wouldn't even mention any of this stuff and consider it behind-the-scenes info. But I'm making an exception here because it was so extreme, and I want you to know what you might expect if you buy a Pi 5 for the purpose of retro game emulation. Now, I'm really just going to sum things up here. I originally wrote this part out to be much longer, and it was actually pretty funny, but I don't want to waste your time, dear viewer, so I'm going to keep things very brief. Now, I ran into trouble right out of the gate with the OS failing to boot, and I had to flash it onto the microSD card a total of 3 times before it worked. And this was on a good Samsung 128GB microSD card. Even when things finally got going, I had a bunch of trouble with resolution switching, which affected my ability to record direct footage. This was even after switching the resolution in Lakka to 1080p. Turns out the Pi 5 often switches resolutions to native all by itself almost any time you make a change to anything visual via RetroArch's menus. Swell. Once things were quote-unquote working, I had to deal with lots of unexpected pauses during emulation of almost any advanced or CD-based system. And no, these pauses did not happen during places where data would normally be loaded off the disk. This was what I was talking about in the Saturn section earlier when I said it worked mostly. And crashes remained a regular issue with Lakka here. I was initially running with the CPU overclocked to 3 GHz and the GPU overclocked to 1 GHz, but I dropped them both to stock to see if it resolved the crashing and freezing issues, but it didn't. I eventually had crashes so hard that it erased Xenoblade off of my hard drive entirely and caused my drive to stop being recognized by Lakka. And I had to take it over to my PC and repair it in there to get it working again. I also tried Lakka on 3 different microSD cards. I need to note here, I was using DualSense with Lakka. Why? Because the first 3 controllers that are all X-input based but not first-party Xbox controllers were simply not recognized by the system no matter what I did. Anyway, after some of the crashes, Lakka stopped recognizing the DualSense also. After seemingly fixing that, Lakka developed a saving problem where it would no longer save games, do save states, save configuration settings, or any of that stuff. Swell. So I cracked open a brand new microSD card, never used, installed Lakka onto it, and had the same saving issues afterwards. And frankly, there were a lot more issues, but I'm gonna stop here. I want to stress, folks, that I've worked with more than a dozen SBCs and never experienced problems like I did with Lakka on the Pi 5. If you were wondering why it's been 2 weeks since my last video, it's because I spent so much time dealing with issues on this thing and trying to fix them all, and frankly, in the end, I wasn't able to. This has been the most frustrating video I've worked on in probably years, if not ever. And I can't even imagine how someone brand new to SBCs, just starting out with these kinds of issues, would deal with this stuff. It'd be awful for them. Alright, so where does that leave us? As I said at the start, I originally intended this video to be like my other Raspberry Pi and SBC videos. I planned to show you the games and their performance and talk about how much better it was than the Pi 4. But the situation here forced me to talk about other things. I didn't want this video to be negative. I know that people don't like negative videos, and I'm sorry that this turned into one. It really wasn't supposed to be, I promise. Now I recognize things could change. All the problems that I ran into might be solved in the future. If that happens, I'll do another video and show you what's been fixed and talk about how much better everything is. Nothing would make me happier. Well, I mean, that's a lie. Plenty of things would make me happier, but you know what I'm saying, you get the gist of it. And there's a lot of glowing videos out there talking about how great the Pi 5 is and how awesome it is that it can run GameCube games at all. And I have to disagree with those assessments. I mean, we don't buy these things just to see, hey, can you put a picture on the screen? Or can you run this at 3 or 4 frames per second? No, that will be awesome if it ran at least most of the games at full speed or close to it. But it absolutely does not do that, even with an overclock to 3 GHz on the CPU and 1 GHz on the GPU. Now don't get me wrong here. It's okay to be enthusiastic about a device or a platform, like the Raspberry Pi in general or the Pi 5 specifically. But you have to temper that with realism, and the situation right now is that the Pi 5 improves some systems to a more playable state than the Pi 4, like Saturn and PSP in particular. But other systems will likely remain forever out of its grasp, like the GameCube and Wii. I can tell you that the state of emulation on the Pi 5 hasn't really changed all that much in the last 6 months or so, and I'll be surprised if it changes very much in the next 6 months or so. And I want to make it crystal clear, I'm not ragging on any emulator developers or OS developers. All those folks are doing awesome work. There's clearly just something weird going on with the Pi 5 hardware, and I'm guessing it's either a documentation problem or a driver problem like I said earlier. If they can get past whatever the issues are with the hardware, I think we may see some real positive changes. And I'll remain optimistic for now that things will eventually improve. Now, I do have to reiterate that it's the year 2024 as I record this, and you can get a mini PC that performs better and costs less than a Pi 5 with all the things you need to operate it. And that's not hyperbole. At current costs, I'm at a place I never expected to reach. A place where I have to say that the Pi 5 really just has no value for a retro gamer today. It's just where technology is right now. If you want to see benchmarks of the Pi 5 versus a similarly priced mini PC, I've linked a video in the description that does several of them. And you can find many other videos that show these two kinds of devices up against each other. And the Pi 5 is outclassed by machines costing significantly less that work right out of the box and don't require any tinkering. Will the Raspberry Pi ever be a viable retro gaming platform again? Not unless prices go down and processing power goes up. Frankly, with the Raspberry Pi company having just gone public, those are things I don't expect to ever see happen. It's kind of sad to say goodbye to a neat little platform that's been in the retro gaming zeitgeist for so long, but I think we've reached that time. The Raspberry Pi and other SBCs are still great for a lot of other things and specialized projects. But as for retro gaming, it's just not worth it anymore, and I think we all have to admit that. Really, the only exception is if you're in a country that has very high electricity generation costs. That's the one situation where it may be worth it over a mini PC, and that's it. Anyway, do you have a Pi 5? What do you think? What OSs do you use on it? Is your experience better than mine with Lakka? Tell me all about it in the comments. That'll do it for this video, my retro gaming friends. If you enjoyed it, please like it and share it online somewhere. If you haven't yet, please subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you won't miss any of my videos. If you want to support the work that I do here, then please consider donating to the channel at either Patreon, Ko-fi, or right here through YouTube channel memberships. With that, I'll say thanks for watching, and see me later.